So it's my pleasure to introduce Adrian Dalca this week. So Adrian has done a PhD with Paulina Goland at MIT, working on medical image analysis. His initial work was on patches, and then he started as a postdoc or instructor at the Martinos Center, together also keeping his affiliation with MIT. He's done some really interesting work marrying deep learning and image registration. And this is, I think, a part of that line. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Adrian, and I'm looking forward to this talk.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. Let me just minimize this so I can. Okay. So yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm gonna talk about a new concept which we are applying to image registration because, well, that's a lot of the work we do is on registration. Also, we find that registration is a nice sort of sandbox to try out ideas. But the general concept I'm going to talk about applies, I think, more broadly. So let's kind of dive into it. I'm going to talk about mostly brain MRI because that's the sort of data we have very easy access to. But I think what I talk about applies, to whatever data you have. So I'm going to dive into registration. When I talk about registration, at least, I refer to finding these dense deformation or correspondence fields between two images. And so I usually refer to the sort of deformable registration rather than sort of the affine or rigid. And registration is this fundamental problem that you will find in a lot of image pipelines. When you want to register a bunch of scans, yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. If you want to register a bunch of scans to a template to do analysis, registering scans before and after a surgery, register scans from a long time ago to a new scan to see how something has changed, to see how maybe a tumor has evolved, propagating information from one scan to another, so segmentation, for example. And it's also very, very related to a lot of other fields. In computer vision, you have optical flow. In computational biology, you have sequence alignment. I actually started doing research in computational biology where I was aligning DNA. So it's kind of very related. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this talk is I'll give a sort of brief introduction of how we do how most tools actually do registration, how sort of deep learning methods look at registration, and what one sort of stubborn problem still exists. I'm going to talk about a tool or an idea that helps with that problem. And then I'm going to spend about half the talk actually on analyzing all kinds of aspects of this. So registration has classically been done, and it's still the predominant strategy, is to get two images and run an optimization problem. The idea is we want to find a deformation field that aligns these two images, and it sort of balances usually these two terms. One of them says we really want the warped image to match up with the fixed image, with the second image. And there's various ways to design this term, but roughly that's what it's saying. And the second term is saying, well, we want some anatomical smoothness or some anatomical constraints on the deformation field. And this equation has driven an awful lot of research in our field, how we define these terms, how we do the optimization, what's best for what task, and so forth. And then in between these two terms, there's this hyperparameter that is very influential in determining the sort of fields that you might get. Now, at some point, maybe 3-4 years ago, learning-based methods really took off, and they basically treated this problem as a black box regression problem. We kind of said, well, take these two images, feed them to a neural network, and hopefully that neural network will give us the deformation field in one shot. And so one of the advantages of such a method would be that it would be fast. You don't need to run an optimization every time you get two images. But how do we tell the network whether deformation fields are any good so that it trains? Well, the simplest thing is to just assume you have some ground truth deformation for training, right? And so that's nice if you do. It's an easy loss function. But the challenge is that in most settings, it's actually kind of difficult to get these ground truth deformations. You can either simulate them, you can run some classical optimization methods to get sort of examples, but it's not a workflow that is easily, that sort of can easily make its way into analyses. And so at some point, these other types of methods came around, including one of ours called VoxelMorph, where the idea was, well, why don't we just assume we only have the data that, that sort of we're interested in, but we will tell the network whether the deformation field is any good by using insights from classical methods. And so in particular, we're going to borrow classical loss functions, and we're going to use that to drive the training of the network. So again, we're looking at an image matching term, a smoothness term, that sort of thing we can sort of use to penalize sort of bad deformation fields. Now, of course, we don't want to optimize a single deformation field. We want to optimize the deformation field for all the images in our training set, all the image pairs. So we're going to sum over those. And again, we're going to be optimizing the parameters of the neural network, not the deformation fields exactly. But what really matters here, what I'm trying to highlight, is that we're using these loss functions that sort of enable us to build on all the previous years of work and registration. But at the end of the day, we still have this hyperparameter, and now we've moved from using a hyperparameter in a single optimization to using a hyperparameter in this larger optimization that is training a whole neural network. Now, if you're able to train this, registration is really nice and easy. You just feed into images and you get your deformation field. And if the images come from approximately the same distribution, you get really good registration. So that's good. But the thing that's still, one thing that's still giving us an awful lot of headache is the fact that we still have to tune these hyperparameters. And so for most of the talk, I'm going to focus on this one hyperparameter that trades off between regularization and image similarity terms. The general idea of what I talk about applies broadly to many types of hyperparameters, but I find that it's helpful to kind of stick with one and go through the talk. So this hyperparameter.
Can I ask a question in this case?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it would apply to hyperparameters with continuous nature, right? It wouldn't apply to the architecture design, which would lead to combinatorial optimization.
That's true, although there are papers very similar to ours that try to do basically neural network architecture search using similar idea. It's more, like you say, yeah, it's more complicated, but those methods actually do seem to work for limited sets of explorations. So maybe we can talk about it at the end. There's a couple of discrete things that we do as well. So on the left here, I just have this graph from the original VoxelMorph paper just to show that, you know, the accuracy, which I'll talk about later, but the accuracy which we measure in dice, you know, varies depending on the hyperparameter value. And it actually varies even more in most instances. This is already in a range that we knew would perform well. So generally, the way we deal with this and the way we dealt with it in VoxelMorph, but I think this is the pipeline for a lot of research, is, you know, there's an important hyperparameter. Well, you're going to train a bunch of different models for that hyperparameter for different values. And then if you're lucky, you kind of got it right. But oftentimes, usually the graduate student will kind of figure out a range that works well amongst those, and they'll run a bunch of models again, right? What has now been coined as graduate student descent. And so one of the goals of this project was to not quite eliminate, but to reduce that headache. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in sort of the next section, which is how we alleviate this problem. And so to be clear, I'm not going to present a method that gives you the optimal hyperparameter value. As I'm going to show in the results, a lot of times there isn't an optimal hyperparameter value for your entire data set or analysis, it will vary depending on what you want to do. So we want to replace this strategy with another strategy that basically enables you to train a single model. And the idea is that this model will approximate all the other models by having the hyperparameter as an input. The idea is you give the hyperparameter as an input, and the model will look at this hyperparameter and say, oh, here's the deformation field that you would want if this is the hyperparameter you chose. So let's see how we could do that. We have this kind of schematic of learning-based registration with your usual loss function. And what we're saying here is we're going to add a hyperparameter as input to the network, and it's going to be the one that's used in the loss, right? So now, if, for example, I give the hyperparameter of 0, I am telling the network, you know what, I don't care about regularization. So give me a deformation field that just doesn't care about smoothness. Versus if I give a high value, then I'm telling the network, you know, I really care about regularization. Give me a very smooth deformation field. So now the network ideally can incorporate that concept. Okay. Now, to be honest, first time we tried this, it didn't work. And you know, the question is, how do you actually do this? Well, you can take a fully connected layer and attach it to the network, or you can copy the hyperparameter value in every voxel and have another channel as an input, things like that. But what those strategies do is they force the same network that was previously had to just do registration. Now it has to do this more complicated registration where it takes the input and it sort of modifies the output. And turns out that's a really hard task. And so our original results didn't really work. But then we had this other idea, which was, well, why don't we actually modify the registration network as a function of the input hyperparameters? And as most ideas, it turns out someone's done this at the sort of abstract machine learning level. And this concept is called a hypernetwork. The idea is you have one network that modifies another network. And it turns out this works really well. What's happening here is you have a network that takes as input the hyperparameter value, and it essentially outputs the parameters of the registration network, which in our case is just a UNet. So it outputs the parameters of the UNet. Okay. So this hypernetwork, it turns out, like, conceptually, at least to us, it felt natural that it should be a really big hypernetwork, you know, that can somehow encapsulate all these registration models it'll approximate. But in practice, it actually turns out just a few layers, fully connected layers with very few nodes turns out to be sufficient. So a small hypernetwork that will predict these large UNets. And I'll talk a little more about that at the end. So that's kind of it. That's the entire idea. It's not super complicated, but the idea is, the hope is that once you train one of these big models, you would be able to very quickly and somewhat effortlessly sort of get the optimal hyperparameters for whatever task you're looking at, for whatever image pair you're looking at. Now, I want to just step back for a second and sort of think about what happened. So classically, you would get these two images, you would get a hyperparameter, and you would run your optimization. And then when unsupervised methods like voxel morph came about with neural networks, what we said was, well, we're going to get a bunch of data, we're going to create a network that approximates the output of that optimization. So that's, in machine learning circles, that's called amortized optimization. Basically amortizing over that entire data set, right? And HyperMorph is doing one more layer of that. Essentially, what you're doing is you're learning a hypernetwork that approximates the registration network, which in turn approximates the optimization. Okay, so it's sort of like two layers of amortization here. One across data and one across hyperparameter values. Okay, so actually maybe since it's a little from what I understand, kind of open. Maybe I can take some questions there if people have before I delve into all kinds of results and analyses.
Hi, Adrian. I have a question.
Hey, yeah.
So if the unit has like 100,000 parameters,
Yep.
is the MLP outputting exactly those 100,000 numbers, or is it outputting some other numbers that influence it?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So in the paper, we output directly those 100,000 parameters. So you have like a bunch of dense layers that are small, and then one last one to the network.
I see.
I have no idea if that's optimal. I should mention, right? So it's a lot of parameters. If the last layer has 16 nodes, then 16 to 100,000 and 16 or 1.6 million. I don't know if that's all necessary or not. We played around with it, and I'm going to have a slide at the end. One thing I can say is bigger hypernetworks don't help. So maybe smaller will, maybe they'll act as regularizers.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Adrian. Can I ask one quick question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So like, let's say if the unit is changed, let's say the capacity of the unit is changed. So does it, and let's say if we keep this hypernetwork fixed, like, I mean, output layers, you will change it according to the capacity of the unit. So were you able to do that experiment, like where if you increase or decrease the capacity of the current unit, does it also affect the performance?
Right.
If
so
hypernetwork is fixed, let's say.
So we didn't try like a lot of sizes of the unit, but we've tried a couple. So we have, if you only train a unit for exactly T1 data, T1 MRI data, you actually don't need a really big unit, and this whole thing works. But for some other projects we have, you need really large units because they have to deal with much more variable data, and it works there as well. So I think if your question is, can this Hypernet deal with various sizes of units?
Yeah.
The answer so far in our experiments is yes.
Okay.
As I will show, you kind of, sometimes you might need to increase the number of nodes, but in the Hypernet, but it's really all small stuff. We're talking 64 nodes or something, not thousands.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Can I also ask a question?
Yeah.
So if you go one slide further, where you show this lambda to performance graph, which is exactly like on the right to the lower part. So this
okay.
Yeah. So in the middle to the very right, you have on the x-axis lambda, and then on the y-axis the performance, which is a concave function, right? But so if you have this hyperparameter network, then the performance becomes a nonlinear function of the lambda you input. So this curve does not resemble this concave function anymore, where you can do like sort of like a gradient, or the how did you call it, the graduate student?
So are you saying, so let's see, so we do, so maybe in a few slides you can ask me again, because we do that. So we do, once we train the network, we optimize the hyperparameter value if we have some validation data, and all of the curves that we've worked with are actually very well behaved, and you can optimize on them. Maybe it'll vary by data, but the ones we've worked with are actually very well behaved.
So am I correct in understanding that there's not the theoretical guarantee that it will be sort of like
No, yeah. I definitely don't make any theoretical guarantees, and I would assume that the answer to that depends heavily on the type of data you're working with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so just before we go into all these sort of experiments I'm going to show, like I said, we work with brain MRI, so we're this is a ton of brain data that we have with different modalities, different populations, different ages, different quality, and I'm going to show that all that matters. But I just want to highlight it's all on sort of brain data. We are currently looking at other data as well, but this was sort of the main stuff in the paper. And one thing is, so again, for a bunch of these experiments, I'm going to be talking about this one hyperparameter. Now, one thing we did, which sort of makes it easier to run experiments, is we balanced the two terms by saying 1 minus lambda plus lambda, right? And so that makes it easy because then we know the range of possible lambdas between 0 and 1, and that's it. If you just have the similarity plus lambda times regularization, the range you're not sure of. Now you might still know, you could still sort of look from 0 to 1 million. That would work, but this makes it sort of easier. And I'm gonna I can make a comment about this at the end as well about how this affects certain things. But and so for the presentation, I'm going to use DICE as a quality metric. I think everyone knows DICE. It basically measures volume overlap in registration. It measures how well anatomical regions overlap after registration. And you can only do this with some sort of validation data where someone has outlined structures somehow, or maybe done that automatically, but somehow we need anatomical structures. But it's a nice way to evaluate whether registration is doing something sensible anatomically. Higher is better. And so what we did as a first sort of sanity check was we ran the baseline, which in our case is voxel-morph, for I think it was between 10 and 12 different sort of values of that hyperparameter. Now, I want to make it clear that we're doing this for evaluation purposes. In reality, in our experiments, it's rare that someone does a full grid search and takes up 12 GPUs just to run this. But we did that sort of to just illustrate how well HyperMorph can approximate these. And so we did that. We plotted the DICE on some validation data. And then we trained a single HyperMorph model. And this is the variant with the Hypernet, right? And after we train that single model, we can now, at validation time, we can now see what the result is for different hyperparameters, right? And it's pretty fast process at test time. And you can see that the blue curve, which is HyperMorph, matches the baselines pretty well. And so this is just a sanity check that a HyperMorph model can approximate a landscape of baseline voxel-morph models.
Adrian, can you talk a little bit about the training of the hypermorph?
The how we train it, you mean, or the
yes.
Yeah. Sorry. So maybe I'll go back to this slide. I probably just so the way we train it is in every batch, or let's say every item we feed 2 images, and we sample the hyperparameter value from some range, in our case from 0 to 1, and in the case of this hyperparameter. And so that's really, all that's different compared to a previous voxel-morph model. And so this goes through, and that value that we sampled also gets used in the loss. So, sometimes you sample 0.1, sometimes you sample 0.8, and so that will kind of change what the network does, because it knows that, like through gradient descent, it knows that, the hyperparameter value is high, therefore the loss will want something regular, therefore I will produce something regular. Does that make sense?
But you change the hyperparameter sample at every batch, at every iteration of stochastic gradient descent.
Yes. Sorry, that wasn't clear. Does that make sense? Or is that weird? Okay. Okay, so that's the strategy, and that's, this is just a result showing that it works. Now, this works for normalized cross correlation. This was, one similarity term. Now, there are many similarity terms, and so we played with a bunch of them: mean squared error, normalize mutual information, especially when you have different contrasts, you might use that. And so for all of these, we only vary this hyperparameter. We feed it in to the network at every iteration. Okay, so this works, at least hopefully it convinces you that it approximates the baselines. Now, how long does it take to train one of these models? It's kind of like an important question, because if it takes as long as the other 10 models, maybe you haven't gained that much. It's a little more precision here, but so it takes, in our experience, about 1.5 to 2 times as much as one of the baseline models, okay, to train. So it's slower than VoxelMorph. It's maybe not a surprise that it's slower, but of course you need to train a bunch of different VoxelMorphs to sort of look at the same range of hyperparameter values. And so if you were to train 10 of them, there's 10 times more GPU hours. Of course, you could parallelize those, then you're taking up 10 GPUs and all your friends are mad at you, but you could do it. Now, the one thing I can't really illustrate in this graph, and I really wish to kind of figure out how to do this, is the headache that's eliminated. So I know that when we were working with VoxelMorph, it's always, every time we get a new data set for which we need to train on, we need to worry about sort of like, we train on a few hyperparameters, then we kind of zero in on some range, we train for a few more, and that's just for one hyperparameter. If you have more, you have to do this larger grid search. And so it's not just like launching a bunch of jobs to the clusters, there's a lot of headache involved with that. I can't show you that on a graph, I don't know how to. But it's not just the savings of compute resources. It's, at least to us, it's been more than that. Now, to be honest with you, the very original thought that led to this was this dream of having a tool where we can give it to a neuroimager or a clinician or someone like that. When we give them a tool where they turn a knob, and as they turn a knob, they get what the registration would be for that hyperparameter value. And the reason we wanted this tool is because in my work, in my PhD, I remember having to tune these hyperparameter values all the time, depending on the data we got from the clinicians. And so we would always run a bunch of different optimizations and look at a bunch of images and stuff like that. So we thought it'd be really nice if you just had one model that could do this. And so this is what we're building towards. This is a demo, but basically on the left, you have the source image. On the right, you have the target. So you want to move the left to the right. In the middle is the warped image. Now, as you can see, it hasn't warped at all. And the reason is because the knob is turned all the way to smoothness, right? So it only cares about smoothness. It doesn't care about similarity. But as I move this knob, the model is able to sort of infer what the registration would be. And depending on the size of your data and so on, this can be very near sort of real time or approximately real time, especially if you work with 2D data. If you work with 3D data, it takes a fraction of a second, 0.3 of a second or something to give you that prediction. And so this is kind of the interactive appeal of this whole thing. But of course, another sort of aspect is a lot of the times we find the optimal hyperparameter value by using some sort of validation data, like segmentations, and we look, well, which hyperparameter gives us the best segmentation overlap for some small part of our data set. And so if you have a hypermorph trained, and now you get a new data set, maybe from a slightly different population or something, and you have some segmentations, you can optimize the hyperparameter value automatically by essentially fixing everything you've trained, fix your hypernetwork, and initialize your hyperparameter value to some value like 0.5. And now you can do gradient descent on this parameter, right? You get your segmentations and you can essentially compute the gradient of, say, your dice loss with respect to this hyperparameter. Right? So at validation time, you can get the optimal hyperparameter value for a specific group of subjects, for a population, for even for just one pair, if you have segmentations. Now, how does that, like, does that really matter? A lot of the times, even in Voxelmorph, when we published our papers, we always just, chose the optimal hyperparameter value for our validation, and that's what we went with all the populations. All our analysis was this one value that we had chosen. And then, someone reads our paper and they use that value for their data. Well, it turns out it matters what hyperparameter value you choose, even for different populations and different other things. So for example, the optimal hyperparameter value for the UK Biobank might be different than the optimal hyperparameter value for PPMI. PPMI is a data set that has lower quality data. Abide is a data set that has a wider population, including a lot of younger patients. The UK Biobank, is this broader study. And so it turns out the optimal hyperparameter value will vary with the type of data you have at validation. It also depends on the task. Unsurprisingly, if you're registering within subject, you might want a different hyperparameter value than if you're registering cross-subject. And it's really nice to have this one big model that can do both, depending on the hyperparameter value you choose at test time. The interesting thing is that it also depends on what structure you're looking at. Now, if you care about the entire brain approximately, you can look at the previous graphs. But let's say you are analyzing, you want to do analysis of just, say, the hippocampus, maybe how hippocampal shape correlates with genetics or something. You might want the hyperparameter that gives you the best behavior around the hippocampus. And that turns out to be different than the best behavior for other structures. Now, this isn't all that surprising. We know this from classical methods. There's a lot of classical work that try to have spatially varying regularization, for example. So there's a lot of work out there that indicates that this is happening. But with HyperMorph, you can tune this hyperparameter at test time very quickly, depending on what you care to analyze. Now, I promised that this works with more than one hyperparameter value, and we've started doing experiments on that. We did some for the paper. We've done more since then. As an example, normalized cross-correlation has a hyperparameter that is the size of the local window. And we've always just sort of used 9 by 9 by 9 as being the local window, mostly because in literature, that's what has been kind of shown to work well. But in some problems that we worked with, such as clinical data where the pixel thicknesses are all over the place, choosing a better window size was important. And so running a ton of models where you're optimizing both the window size and the trade-off is actually extremely cumbersome. And with HyperMorph, you can change almost nothing. You just have 2 inputs instead of 1, and the same thing will work. And so here what I'm showing is the dice in a color bar, window size on the left, this pattern on the right. Now, it's a smooth behavior, which is nice, but you can see that depending on the window size you choose, you might want, there's a slightly different, slightly shifted scale for this hyperparameter. Now, this is with nice data. We're working now with clinical data, and that sort of changes, but this is just to show that HyperMorph can also be used to see the effect of 2 hyperparameter values.
Adrian,
And
a quick question. The window size, is this a parameter in the structure of your network, or is this something, again, very close to your cost function? So
it's in the structure of how we evaluate a loss function. So basically, right. And when you do the loss function, you have to choose a window size. And we just chose actually in PyTorch, you probably can just do it on the fly. But we worked with TensorFlow in this case, and basically you just choose a maximum window size, and then every time at every iteration, if it's sampled to be a lower window size, you will just use a smaller window and differentiate through that.
Okay,
so
but it's part of the cost function, essentially.
It's part of the cost function,
right?
Yeah. We have done, I don't have this in this, but related to this question, we have done things like optimizing the latent space in an autoencoder, the size of the latent space in an autoencoder. And it's that's you could argue is an architectural choice, but it's roughly, it works the same way, right? You can make a really large latent space and you can use only some of it depending on the batch. Now what you're really saving here, again, is time. Now you're looking at 2 hyperparameters. If you were to do a grid search, even just 5 by 5 options, that's 25 models that you have to run. That's enormous. At least we don't have that many GPUs to just throw things at them. But again, more than that, it's the ability to do this at all, because in practice, we wouldn't do a 5 by 5 grid search. You would kind of just hope that you get it right, maybe based on some literature and so on, because you just don't have the capacity to do that, or at least we don't. And so that's kind of the savings here. Now it turns out there's a bunch of interesting properties for these models as well. We're not 100% sure why they're happening. We're trying to poke at it. One of them is that these models are a lot more robust to initialization, and that probably has to do with how hypernetworks behave compared to UNets. But basically, if I just reinitialize HyperMorph several times and I run it, I get very, very close to the same answer. If I just initialize the UNet several times and I run it to do registration, I actually get quite a bit more variability. So this is also kind of, so we believe this has to do with the stability of the Hypernet and the fact that it's exposed to so many values of the hyper value, but we're not sure. But it does point to another reason why they're useful, because you can sort of depend on the result as opposed to having to run 3 or 5 versions, because now imagine you have to run a grid search and you have to run 5 of each of those models. Again, it's a computational issue. Now, why does this work has been a question. Like, why is it that one hypernetwork can approximate an entire landscape of models? And the main takeaway is that those landscapes of models that are trained with different hyperparameter values are actually not that different. They spend a lot of the time learning the same stuff, properties of images, and then they vary a little bit in how they treat those properties. So here what I'm showing are, so at the top is sort of the moved image just for reference, but what I'm showing are 4 different features at the end of the network. On the x-axis, sorry that it's a little small, but on the x-axis is the hyperparameter value. Now at the extremes, you get these weird behaviors. So if I turn off the regularization field, for example, I get this weird behavior where everything turns off. It just gives me 0 deformation field. But in the middle, I can see that the feature varies smoothly, right? So it's not like as I jump from one hyperparameter value to another, all of a sudden I get this completely different feature, and it's a completely different model to learn something completely different. And so,
sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Showing here is the features of the hypermorph network.
Yeah, it's the features of the UNet. So you take the Hypernet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, but not training it from scratch for all these.
Right. Yeah,
terms.
sorry. Not training it from scratch. If I were to train it from scratch, the biggest difficulty I'd have is matching up the features, right? Because they're completely, the first feature of one model, I could train the same model again, and now that feature will be somewhere else, or a similar feature will be somewhere else, and matching that up would be a nightmare. But all I'm saying is, what the model isn't learning these completely discrete things as you jump between hyperparameters, it's learning the smooth behavior that's able to capture the same thing. And so part of why hypermorph works at all is because it doesn't have to learn 10 or 100 different models. It has to learn one model that it kind of modifies smoothly.
Sorry. Also, in the hypermorph network itself, so what are the nonlinearities are you using?
So for the in the Hypernet part, we're just using ReLUs in the normal layers. The last layer that goes from the hypernetwork to the UNet, we played with both just linear, so no nonlinearity, or 10H. And both of those work. The linear actually just works better, so we just took the 10H out. So it's very simple, right? Nothing fancy. And then for just to complete that, the unit is exactly the same, same linearities you might use, same whatever.
Talking about non-linearities, but a different one. Right now you have your lambda that you're sampling here from 0 to 1.
Yeah.
Or whatever you have there. It's a one-to-one mapping between what you're using in your training and what you have in the cost function.
Right.
Which is your design choice. But you could have different mappings, right? So that you have a tangents or whatever, so that you train on numbers from minus to plus infinity and just map in your cost function to 0 and 1, where you would get definitely a different types of interpolation. Did you try anything along that line?
Yeah. So right, yes. So we tried, so basically another way, correct me if I get this wrong, but another way to describe what you said is that you can have, you can avoid sampling from uniform, but you can sample from other distributions.
Yeah, exactly. Like in a standard baseline optimization, you can run on exponential steps or on linear steps or something like that.
Exactly, yeah. So we have done that. So actually the very first time, I'm gonna jump a bunch of slides and I'll come back. So actually the very first time we tried just balancing mean squared error and smoothness, we had a problem, which is that most of the useful hyperparameter values are at this very, very small range at the beginning, right? And the reason that is true is because this balance between these two terms depends on how you normalize your images. Your fields will be the same, meaning, they'll move 1 voxel or 5 voxels. But if your images are between 0 and 1 or 0 to 255, the first term changes. And so that means that you might squish the useful hyperparameter values. And so what we tried for a while was to sample exactly like you're saying, changing the probability distribution that we're sampling from, right? So we'd say, okay, we kind of have an idea where things are. Let's put a Gaussian on that and sample from that. That works. But what we realized later was that if you just balance your loss terms a little better, so if you normalize by your variance, you'll do much, you'll have these smoothly behaving things all across the range most of the time. But yes, to concretely answer your question, yes, I think that is an important aspect. And for many hyperparameters, you might want to sample from a distribution rather than just uniform. Okay, so I was almost at the end. We looked at different hyper architectures, Hypernet architectures, and as usual, we started off completely wrong. We had these really large architectures, and they worked. They took a long time to train, but it turns out you don't need them. 3-4 layers of fully connected, 3-4 fully connected layers with just 64 nodes does really well. If you have only 16 nodes at every layer, it doesn't do perfectly. It's still not horrible. It doesn't quite get the baselines, but as soon as you get to 64, you're basically there, right? So that's kind of nice that you don't need these enormous networks. So I just wanted to make a couple of words about at least how I feel about all this. So I think I want to emphasize that this is our first foray in this. It's the first time, we had this idea, we played with it, and it works in some sense. It offloads all that effort into this just very quick testing phase. But I think it's really just the beginning. I think you can do so many interesting things with this. First of all, you can apply it to a bunch of different applications, right? There's always hyperparameters that we care about. Many of them are continuous. Some of them are discrete, but we can still optimize them over or approximate them with the hypernetwork. We found it super useful when testing out quick ideas. So a lot of times you want to test out an idea you just had, but it depends on the hyperparameter. So you try it, doesn't work, and now you don't know, is the idea bad or is the hyperparameter bad? And so this allows us to experiment with that much quicker. And we've tried this for things like data augmentation, where you need to decide how much to augment, or segmentation, where you might, depending on the segmentation algorithm, you might have some hyperparameter on how confident the algorithm is, or things like that. And so I'm very excited about where this can take us. And the most important thing, I think, is it enables new ideas for new modeling. So for example, you don't have to commit to a single hyperparameter. Sometimes for some models, it's useful to maybe integrate over a bunch of different hyperparameter values and see how robust a follow-up model is to that and integrate all that together. So I'm really excited about kind of where this can take us, not just where it is in registration, although even there, I think it's sort of very useful. So I want to thank the co-authors, especially Andrew. Andrew's going to be doing this presentation probably a lot better at IPME, and everyone else who was involved, Malta, Bruce, and John. And as a summary, I'll leave this slide up where basically this has been our motivation the entire time, avoiding the need to train many different redundant to some degree models and instead train one big model that approximates the effect of hyperparameter values on the output. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very nice talk. Are there any questions?
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for the nice talk. Can I go ahead with the question?
Please.
Yeah. So let's say you trained this model, right? So let's say if you give it to some clinical setting later on, like it's a new data set with a new scanner. Let's say the most probability is that you won't have any segmentation masks there, like in the new setting. You can get from FreeSurfer or something. But then how would you modify this lambda? Like how would you learn this lambda in that?
Yeah, so I agree. So it's a good question. And that's kind of where the interactive aspect comes in. So this question exists, right? Whether HyperMorph exists or not. How do you choose the hyperparameter value? And the truth is in registration, it's a bit subjective at the end of the day. And what we used to do in that situation is we would train a bunch of models and look at the, maybe 5 models, and then you would look at the 5 and you would choose it visually. I mean, I did this in my PhD. We would need to do this because we would get clinical data that wasn't segmented. The hope here is that what will help you is that you'll have this interactive tool that gives you fine precision and very quick response, and you can still do it interactively. I'm afraid that's kind of the best you can do if you have no other information. Now, if you come up with some other metric, if someone comes up and says, no, I know a way to get the best hyperparameter value, you just use this metric. The good thing is you can use that metric to optimize right? You can use it with HyperMorph. But to my knowledge, in most of the scenarios, there's a lot of subjectivity in this if you don't have annotations of some sort.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and the second question is, in that scenario, what would be the fixed image? Would it be like some kind of an atlas or like an average image of the training data set or something like that?
Yeah, so it varies. So we've done this manually for, like in this, we worked with a lot of stroke data, and there we were looking at analyzing to an atlas, so we do it with an atlas. But I imagine that this will also be useful in scenarios where, so a lot of the clinicians we work with have these kind of longitudinal scans where they took something and they're following up a patient, right? So there it's just subject to subject, or it's the same subject rather. And you can imagine that you can tune this hyperparameter to affect, how much it's trying to adapt to the tumor growing or not. So the answer is, I think, any of these scenarios.
Okay, yeah, perfect, thanks.
Adrian, do you have any results on parameters that do not directly influence the cost?
That are not directly part of the cost function. So in registration,
or elsewhere. I find it very impressive that it's able to learn this through this just gradient descent. Usually people would do meta learning over these type of stuff, and they would basically approximate with few gradient steps, right? But here you're saying, I don't do meta learning, I train everything.
Yes.
So it's very surprising that actually it's able to learn this. And I'm wondering if would you have any results on something that's not a part of the cost function?
So I can tell you a couple of things. I don't have slides, but I will. So one experiment that we did right after this, that you will relate to is data augmentation. So with elastic data augmentation, right? So there was always the question about how much do you deform, and of course you've done it with GANs and such, but we use that as a hyperparameter. So how much you deform and how smooth the deformation is. And so you apply that deformation at the beginning. I think, and so you use that to apply your deformation, and you use that as this Hypernet. So it's not part of the loss, right? And that works very well so it gives you this landscape of these two parameters and how well you do under those deformations. And so there's this sweet spot that basically says this is how much you should deform. We've also done experiments on the number of segments you might care about in unsupervised segmentation. So, classical EM intensity-based stuff, so you have a network that approximates a certain number of labels, right? So if you have 3 labels in brain, you hope that it would, collapse to white matter, gray matter, CSF. But you can imagine just changing the number of parameters, and you could sort of see this kind of super pixelizing. That works. Or it works to some degree. You need priors if you need these to be meaningful, but still it can do it. We looked at, as I mentioned, autoencoders where we capture the number of parameters in the compression, the latent space. And so there's 2 neat effects there. So one is, so it's the same idea, right? You sample the hyperparameter, which tells you how much of the latent space you should use, how much of the latent space the autoencoder should use. And there's a couple of interesting effects that happen. So in a normal autoencoder, your data is kind of scrambled everywhere, right? The nodes in the middle of the autoencoder, there's no ordering to them in a sense. But now if you do this, what happens is the network will try to put as much information as it can in the first few latent dimensions, because those are the ones that it will most often see, right? So if I sample 1, it'll see the first dimension. If I sample 10, it'll see the first 10 dimensions. And so it's able to learn this effect. So if you tell it, I only want 1 latent dimension, it will put as much information as it can in the first one. And that will reduce things like overfitting and so on.
But for instance, in that case,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
There is no regularization, right? So I'm assuming in that case, the higher the dimension, the better the autoencoder cost.
Yes.
When well trained, that should be the behavior.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
So.
But of course, in some situations, you want an autoencoder that compresses information that you don't care about, so that you can use that in probability distributions and so on, right? So yes, as part of the learning, you're right. But I'm saying, but as a downstream utility, you might want a different compression.
Thanks.
Right. And we've done other things too. Oh yeah, we're playing with atlas building now, right? So we have this paper that will just do atlas building as part of registration. So atlas building has a couple of other hyperparameters, like how important is the centrality of the atlas or things like that. Again, something you can play with. We don't have results on that though. We have a separate thing on unsupervised reconstruction. So, and supervised reconstruction, we're doing experiments now, right? Where again, you have these hyperparameters that obviously all about, and that trade off, image fidelity with regularization. And it's the same idea, right? You can.
Adrian, do you have experiments on segmentation?
So,
tuning the cost function.
Say again, the last
part. Well, you could also tune cost functions. Many do in segmentation.
Right. So we've done a bunch of stuff with segmentations, but they're kind of different things. So, so if you're just training a supervised UNet, there's no loss hyperparameter. There's a data augmentation hyperparameter, which I talked about. There's another hyperparameter, which is the that actually turns out to affect results, which is the slope of the softmax at the end. and that turns out to affect results, and so you can play with that. We've played with balancing different terms. Yeah, so like, you want to train with both dice and cross correlation or something. Some people do this. We haven't actually found huge effects there. Right. We've trained on, so we have this unsupervised registration framework, unsupervised, where basically you have an atlas, probabilistic atlas, very classical style. You have a probabilistic atlas, and then you have your image. And so the idea is you register your probabilistic atlas to your image, and you have some model for likelihood, kind of like Kuhn style model. And there, how regular your registration is kind of the same thing, right? And that also has an effect. So in some situations there is an effect, in some situations there isn't an effect, and then in some situations we don't have results yet. But there was the location where we saw the most in segmentation, the situation where we saw the most effect was the data augmentation. Like there, I mean, we know data augmentation helps, right? But how much and at what point do you start hurting it? I mean, as Ender has shown and people in this group have shown, right? You can stretch it quite a bit, but at some point it does break. So that was a nice result.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Björn. Please go.
No.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Adrian. That was my question.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk, Adrian. This reminds me a lot of like continual learning, where you also see like these hyper networks, but there often it's like kind of, there for me it was always a bit like you're remembering a specific network for a specific task. And yeah, I think like the nice thing here is like it's kind of continuous. At least that's how it looks like. Because for continual learning, you had like a tasks and different tasks, and it was kind of discrete, and it felt a bit like a memory network. But here it's something continuous. Can you talk a bit more about the continuity? So whenever a hyperparameter you sampled, it never broke down, or do you have an idea of why this?
So everything I'm about to say is speculative, but so I actually think the continuity helps it an awful lot compared to discrete things, because the network is exposed to this, it's exposed not just to 5 numbers or something, it's exposed to this continuous range. So it has to learn something meaningful. We've actually played around with hyper networks that encode tasks for a different project, and it's way harder because you have a discrete number of inputs there, right? It's like, you might have 10 different tasks or whatever, but it's a discrete small number, and you're going from, this value to an entire unit. And so what the hypernetwork can do, if you're only ever sampling a very small number of options, is it could just learn to memorize that whole thing. And so it'll memorize 10 different units and it's happy, but that's not going to generalize to anything useful. So the continuity actually helps a lot here, I think. And so, because it sort of has to actually learn a function that relates these things as opposed to just memorizing 5 different networks. So in that way, I think we've been lucky, but also intuitively, I think it kind of makes sense in that you're trying to, you're tasking the hypernetwork with this idea that it has to learn an effect of something that is continuous. And so, I don't know, to me intuitively, it feels like something you should be able to do. I mean, if I look at a registration and I say, oh, this should be more smooth, if I had the motor functions, I could easily smooth out the entire deformation field. I know what has to happen, right? So in some ways, I think it's easy. So yeah, those are my comments. Again, all speculative. We haven't done thorough analysis on this or anything.
Thank you very much, Adrian.
Sure. Anything else?
Are there any more questions? I think we already asked quite a number.
Sorry, can I ask one quick last question? Yeah, sorry.
No.
So like the parameters which the HyperMorph model gives, does it only include the weights and biases, or does it also include this batch norm, both the parameters and...
I see. No, there's no batch norm here. It's a good question. we have another project where we're trying to learn the, where we're trying to do the same with, so, you know, for example, the UNet has this downsampling by 2 or whatever, or I mean, you know, max pool or something. So we're trying to learn what is the optimal value there. So it's not, you know, maybe 2 isn't the best, maybe something else is the best. And so in that project, we found the batch norm is really important. We haven't gotten, to my knowledge, unless I'm misremembering, we haven't been able to train a hypernetwork to learn the batch norm parameters for that. I have no idea why that is, and whether it's, you know, just something that we haven't played with enough, or there's some fundamental reason for that. But we haven't been able to. In these networks, in voxelmorph and hypermorph, we never used batch norm to a large extent because our batch size is 1, and so you know, it's not that useful. But yeah, so that's kind of my not very satisfactory answer.
Yeah, but the mu and like the mean and the sigma, they will change with the batch norm, batch size, I guess. So I think how it populates will affect the sigma.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I don't.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Sure.
If there's time, can I ask like a more discussion kind of a question?
Sure.
So actually, the number of parameters that you learn goes up by like the number of parameters of your hyper network. No.
Yeah.
So on one hand, you have
in this architecture, yeah, we've tried others I can talk about, but yeah, in this architecture.
So on one hand, you have many more parameters. So it should, like in the traditional sense, it should kind of make your model more flexible and therefore, let's say, more prone to overfitting in some sense. On the other hand, you have these regularization effects where because you train on a number of lambda values, you see, you know, robustness to initialization that you showed and so on. Mm-hmm. Is there something to comment on there, this kind of trade-off, or is there?
Well, I can, yeah, I can always comment on things and just, you know, take everything with a grain of salt. So the reason, so to the overfitting comment, which I think is a great one, I think, so we don't, by every analysis we've had, we don't overfit that network. And I think the reason is because you have this continuous space. Again, we overfit dramatically if you have this discrete, you know, like the task scenario I described, where you only have 10 tasks. You overfit dramatically because you have way more parameters. So, you know, you just memorize a UNet for every task, and now you have a bunch of stuff left over that you could just play with. But the continuity, I think, saves you. Having said that, you know, there are other architectures where you're not so overwhelmed with parameters. You can imagine embeddings. You can imagine only modifying certain layers. You can, you know, there's all these things you could do that capture the same effect. You know, you can imagine half of the registration network just extracts useful features that are useful for any lambda, and then only the other half, you know, needs to be hyperized. You know, and that's perfectly reasonable architecture. Playing with architectures is not really my forte. It's not what we do in our group. So we haven't explored these to a large extent. I will say they overfit less if you have fewer parameters. For the task project that I mentioned, we're exploring, we have a version where you only modify the last couple of layers. The hypernetwork only modifies the last couple of layers, and that works, you know, that overfits a lot less. So it's not, you know, it's not crazy, but, you know, that's ongoing, and I don't really know, you know, kind of the final answer on that. So those are my random comments. I mean, I think it depends a lot on the relationship you're trying to learn. If it's a continuous one, I think your overfitting chances are a lot smaller. Also, there's no generalization issue in this hyperparameter, right? So for the tasks that I was talking about, you have to generalize to a new task. That's a problem. But here, you're never going to ask the network for a hyperparameter that you didn't train on. So that helps a lot. With issues, you might skip part of the range if you want during training to see if you're robust to that, but yeah. Any other discussion points?
I think it's time to thank you.
Okay. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's great.
It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Very much.
Thanks, Adrian.